Hello everybody and welcome back to another video. I'm SocietySucks and today I'm checking out why did China give up so much of Siberia to Russia. I'm not exactly sure how much land China gave up to Russia, but I do know that the Chinese lost at least part of the Manchuria region to the Russians, but that's pretty much all I know. So let's see how much they really lost and why they lost it.
After the Mongols conquered China and established a dynasty of their own, the steppe and some of the lands now known as Siberia were closely tied to the Chinese state. But if you look at a map, you'll notice that China stops here, and barring Mongolia, those lands are now a part of Russia.
Way more than I expected.
Why exactly is this the case? Why did China lose so much of Siberia to Russia? So by the time Kublai Khan was done, he had firmly established the Yuan dynasty, which ruled over all of these lands. His successors weren't great, and it wasn't long until the Yuan dynasty had been unestablished. It was reduced to a client state of the now ascendant Ming dynasty, alongside the Jurchen people to the east who were centered in the lands now known as Manchuria. In the late 16th century, Ming control collapsed there and it became independent under the Jin dynasty. In the 1630s, the Jurchens, who after some PR consultancy changed their name to the Manchus, defeated the Northern Yuan and then turned their full attention to China proper, which was having some issues with rebellion. As all of this was going on, the Chinese northern border was being encroached by some new faces, the Russians. It won't shock you to know that it wasn't long until the two were skirmishing. However, the Jin were too busy conquering China. As all of this was going on, the Jin's northern border was being encroached by some new faces, the Russians. It won't shock you to know that it wasn't long until the two were skirmishing. However, the Jin were too busy conquering China to respond. Beijing fell in 1644,
so they just didn't
at which point the Jin,
have
after
time
some
to deal
more
with
PR
them.
consultancy, changed their name to the Qing. And over the following decades, it subjugated much of the rest of China.
Okay, so based on the information so far, I'm guessing that they just didn't see Russia as that much of a threat. They believed it to be more important to conquer the rest of China, which makes sense.
During this time, the Russians had made some inroads into Manchuria, and the Qing did not like that, and so, war. This ended poorly for the Russians, and so their ruler, Kosar Ivan, was actually Sophia. She pushed to make peace so that she could focus on scheming against that Peter kid. The two states negotiated, and Russia agreed to recognize that the Chinese border extended to here, and in return the Russians would be allowed to trade. Several decades later, the two signed another treaty which settled the border along Mongolia. And after this, both sides were happy with the status quo. So what changed? Well, it was the British and the French. Whilst Russia had just received a black eye from them in the Crimean War, when the two turned their attention to China in 1856, the Russian government spied an opportunity. And whilst the Qing were busy, the Russians sent soldiers and settlers into this region around the Amur River.
Of course they did.
The Chinese weren't okay with this, but there wasn't much they could do about it because Second Opium Wars. And it was here that the Russians made some genius diplomatic moves. After China refused to negotiate over any Russian annexations, the Russians started to talk to the British, the French and the Americans about mediating the war. They agreed because the Russians had very friendly relations with the United States, whilst at the same point having pretty poor relations with the other three. And as such, it seemed about as fair as it was going to get. However, one man, Nikolai Ignatiev, the Russian ambassador to China, was extremely clever in turning the situation to Russia's benefit. He made it clear to the Chinese emperor that the Opium Wars could only be ended if Russia told the Allies that they were getting a fair deal. And the only way that that could happen is if Russia got a fair deal. And said fair deal involved Russia getting those lands it was starting to settle, and also some more just to be certain. The Chinese reluctantly agreed, and so Russia's eastern border took the shape that it's known for today. And to make matters worse for Beijing, a mere 4 years later, the two signed a treaty in which Russia gained all of this in Central Asia. So that's all settled then, right? Nope. It won't surprise you to learn that the Chinese weren't happy with these agreements.
Yeah, no shit.
Seeing them not as treaties negotiated by peers, but as unequal diktats. Mostly because they were. When the Qing dynasty fell apart, Mongolia broke away from it, and soon after Tuva broke away from Mongolia. The Russian Empire, no Republic, no SFSR, essentially took it as a protectorate of its own before the USSR annexed it entirely.
They annexed it,
and after
pretty
World
much,
War II and the Chinese Civil War were finished, a certain Mao Zedong was in charge of China, and he disagreed with Russia's control over what he saw as rightful Chinese territory. He had hoped that his fellow communists would agree to return the land, mostly in the name of disowning imperialist gains and brotherly cooperation, but fun fact, no. But what exactly could Mao do about it? Well, he could always launch a border war, and so in 1969, he did just that. Exactly what Mao wanted isn't known for certain. But what we do know is that things got very heated, in fact they almost went nuclear, and in the end little changed. Except for the number of women who had living sons, that is. The disagreements continued, but barring some very small-scale changes after the USSR's collapse, the border remains mostly the same, with these Siberian lands still being very much a part of Russia.
I mean, you know, China is all about getting more territory. Who knows, maybe in the future they'll get that stuff back. I don't think anybody would really mind or care if they did. Well, except the Russians, but who cares about them? I mean, hey, the Russians themselves made the argument. If you owned land in the past, you should be allowed to start a war to go get it back. So why don't the Chinese just do that, you know? Seems fair to me. So yeah, why did China give up this territory to Russia? Because they didn't have a choice and the Russians are assholes, like usual. So yeah, nothing surprising there. It's kind of funny though. The Russians held power over the Chinese. Now it's just the opposite. China holds so much power over Russia, and there's nothing the Russians can do about it because they're completely reliant on them. Not for everything, obviously, but for certain things. But yeah, we'll see how it goes. Maybe China will get back those lands. Russia is not exactly in a strong position now. They're not going to be in a strong position for decades to come because they completely screwed themselves over with the Ukraine war. You know, because they're morons. I think I heard that apparently Putin has decided to lower defense spending. You know, because their economy's fucked. And yeah, you know, just the longer this war goes on, the Russia-Ukraine war, the weaker Russia will get. Soon enough, China may finally decide that enough is enough and, you know, get it back. I mean, that probably won't happen. Not yet anyway, but hey, maybe in the future. Russia loves taking territory that isn't theirs. China loves taking territory that isn't theirs. I don't see why China just can't take from Russia. But yeah, enough about that. Hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please consider subscribing and leaving a like. If you want to see more reactions, check out this video right here. And with that, I'll see you in the next video.